Hello and welcome everyone to the Asia Society, or I should say the virtual Asia Society. Great to have you with us again. I'm Tom Nagorski, Executive Vice President at the Asia Society. Delighted to bring you to what is one of our longest standing traditions at the Society. Of course, we've never done it quite this way, but we've never quite had a moment like this one. For nearly 2 decades, the Society has awarded and presented the Osborn Elliott Prize for Excellence in Journalism about Asia. This is the 17th edition of the honor. The prize is named, as most of you know, for the late great journalist Osborn Elliott, who, among many other things, served with great distinction as editor-in-chief for Newsweek magazine for many years. He was an early and powerful proponent and voice in what came to be known as civic journalism, focused on public policy. Oz Elliott was also a longstanding trustee of the Asia Society. And over all these years, the Oz Prize, as it's sometimes known, has honored work really from all across Asia. And this year's prize goes to a journalist who has distinguished himself with reporting from all across China. You'll hear more about his work in a moment. That's Gerry Shih from the Washington Post, who will be joining us in a moment. With its selection, the jury this year for the prize also took note of the recent expulsions of foreign journalists from China. Sadly, Gerry was among them. And our conversation with Gerry Shih will come in a moment. A reminder to all of you watching on this platform, you probably know this by now, that the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen is where you can ask your questions. The way we're going to do this is there will be a conversation that Gerry will have moderated by the chair of the Oz Elliott Prize jury, Marcus Brauchli, who served as editor of the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. But before we do that, and to get us started, it is great to have with us, she's usually with us in person with other members of the Elliott family, Oz Elliott's daughter, Dinda Elliott, herself a longtime foreign correspondent, served in Moscow, Beijing, and Hong Kong, as we were just talking before we got started here. Dinda Elliott now serves as Senior Vice President at the China Institute here in New York. Dinda will say a few words about how this year's jury, of which she is a member, made its selection. It's always a tough selection. But our thanks again to all of you who are joining us for this event today. And with that, I'm going to turn over our online platform to Dinda Elliott. Dinda, great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Tom. And thanks so much for giving me the chance to say a few quick words. As Tom said, I'm Oz Elliott's daughter, and I was a journalist for about 25 years, serving as Newsweek's bureau chief in Beijing back in the late 1980s. And if you're trying to do the math, let's just say I was a very, very precocious toddler. Gerry, it was an absolute thrill for all of us to read your work. Your up-close reporting took us far beyond the Communist Party as bad guy China narrative and brought us up close with the human cost of an ambitious country striving, often ruthlessly, to succeed without the norms of rule of law to protect the common man. Your stories had a sort, as I was reading them, I kept thinking your stories had a sort of Upton Sinclair quality to them. It's a sure thing that my father would have been absolutely thrilled that you won this award, Gerry. Firstly, the degree of difficulty in the reporting that you did is really kind of beyond belief in a country like China. Oz believed from the bottom of his heart in the importance of journalism as a way to join us all together in a united civil society, as Tom mentioned. He also believed in the individual journalist driven by a fire in the belly, and in the importance of great storytelling as a way to find deeper understanding behind the headlines. Your work absolutely embodies all of that. Congratulations, Gerry.
Thanks very much.
So this is Marcus Brauchli. I'm the chairman of the Oz Prize, and I think I'm going to take over here from Dinda and lead the conversation with Gerry, if I may. So as Gerry, it's a great honor to be talking with you, and your work, as Dinda and Tom have said, was excellent. Just for purposes of transparency, for those who know me, I should say that while I covered China too for many years and ran the Washington Post for nearly 5, Gerry and I never intersected or worked together. So this is my first time to really do a deep dive into Gerry's work. The Oz Prize jury this year reviewed, as we always do, so many remarkable stories from across what some people are now calling the Indo-Pacific. And there were, as there increasingly are, very strong entries from newsrooms in the region, as well as some blockbusters from some of the biggest global media groups. Human rights and environment remain mainstays of the entries, as they should be in a region that pays too little attention to both. But really, this was a China year at the Oz Prize. And the stories that others covered as well as you, Gerry, were remarkable. There were, of course, the protests in Hong Kong, where a tightening of Beijing's control over that vibrant bastion of business has led to a popular backlash that turned violent and even deadly. The coverage by some of the news organizations whose work we reviewed, including Reuters and the Wall Street Journal, was very powerful. We also saw remarkable investigative work at the New York Times and from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists into the Communist Party's cold-blooded planning of the brutal suppression in Xinjiang of the Uyghur people. Last year, many of you will recall, the Oz Prize was awarded to the Associated Press for its coverage of that crackdown. Gerry, your work stood out for a couple of reasons, as Dinda said. First, the scope of your reporting, and second, the freshness and authenticity of the stories. The range of your coverage. You wrote about stories on everything from the treatment of China's Hui minority to Beijing's emerging military presence in Central Asia, to the very human story of the men who dug and blasted the economic miracle of Shenzhen into existence and are now suffering from silicosis as a result of that work. As it happens, all the members of the Oz Prize in this Oz Prize jury this year had worked at some point in China. And so we know, as Dinda suggested, how challenging it can be to first conceive a story that tells the world something original and important about a country that's being very closely covered, and second, to line up the interviews and gain the confidence of people who are willing to talk to a foreign journalist openly. Tragically, we aren't the only ones who recognize the value of what a great foreign correspondent can do in China. The Chinese government, as Tom said, recently expelled you among other American journalists as part of that tit-for-tat downward spiral in relations between these two great powers. So maybe, Gerry, we should start there. And maybe if you could just tell us a little bit about where you are now, and since you're not in China, how you're going to be covering China and how the Post is going to be covering China, how American journalists are going to cover China going forward.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Marcus. I guess, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you to you, to Dinda, for your very, very kind words. It's absolutely a tremendous honor for me to hear that I was given this prize. You know, when you gave me a call a couple of weeks ago to tell me, I didn't even know that the Post had nominated me, and I guess to be considered that, you know, I might be judged to have produced work among the likes of you know, Reuters and how they covered Hong Kong this year, the New York Times, how they covered Xinjiang. It's truly special. So thanks a lot. Yeah. So as you might know, I was in China until March when the Chinese government informed the three American newspapers that many of us, the majority of us, in total more than a dozen, would have to leave the country within several weeks. So since April 1st, I've been in South Korea, where I'm still hoping and trying my best to cover China from afar. It's not quite the same. As you can imagine, so much of my reporting in the last couple of years has been that kind of, you know, of the on the ground flavor. And I think that, you know, that was the type of storytelling that was very important, very vital, but unfortunately we'll have to find other ways to keep doing the job.
Are big news organizations from the US, I mean, the news organizations that got expelled are the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post.
That's right.
And they all lost, as I understand it, American journalists.
That's
but
right.
They were allowed to keep journalists in the country who are not American. Is that right?
That's right.
So are they, do you have a sense that, you know, as we Americans who sit and read the newspaper to try or read news from what used to be newspapers, are we going to be informed on China as well as we should be?
You know, I think, you know, there will certainly be a huge loss for, I think, you know, readers, not just in the US, but across the world. In fact, I think, you know, we often hear from the Chinese, ordinary people, even Chinese officials, that they often turn to international news sources to get sort of a relatively unvarnished view of what's happening inside their own country. I think that let's take the example of one of the stories that I did last year. I went down to Jiangsu province in the wake of a large chemical explosion that killed scores of people. I was in a very kind of poor village that was just a couple of 100 meters away from the blast site. That was basically a crater that was, a quarter-mile wide. And the villagers, at first, they very tentatively sort of began to talk to me, to tell me about the experience of sort of living for decades in the shadow of this basically a ticking time bomb. In the middle of the conversation, one of the villagers suddenly said, hey, so who did you say you worked for again? And I said, well, I work for the Beijing Bureau of the Washington Post. We're an American newspaper. Can't really dance around that. And then she said, well, how do we know that you are not here to smear us and make China look bad and write about all this negative news? And then somebody else in the group said, hey, listen, if this guy doesn't write the story, if we don't tell him our story, do you really think that the Jiangsu official newspaper or the local city newspaper, they're going to accurately tell our story? And then everybody else in the circle said, yeah. Like what he said is right. We should trust and talk to this guy. And so I think, from the ordinary people to the Chinese scholars, academics, think tank types, government officials that I run into, on a daily basis, or I ran into on a daily basis, I should say. I think there is still a tremendous desire, despite all the tensions and the sort of the chill that we're living in today between the U.S. and China. There's a great desire to interface, to engage, to get the story out, to have that exchange of ideas, and so, long way of saying that I do really regret this, especially at this moment when there's a global crisis and public health emergency unfolding.
Yeah. Well, clearly the mutual understanding element of journalism is critical because it creates some, factual foundations for understanding, which probably leads to greater stability. But how much those people you see in China, do they have access to, will they ever see what you write? How much of what American journalists write gets recirculated in China? How much of it gets around the so-called Great Firewall?
That's a very interesting and I think a sort of an urgent question. As you might know, as many people might know, many of the international news outlets are now blocked inside China. So that includes everything from the New York Times and Bloomberg, beginning about a decade now ago, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the BBC, the list goes on. Basically, any major sort of American or British outlet that you can think of. China, of course, has a very tightly controlled and tightly censored media ecosystem that largely revolves around the social media platform WeChat. And I think that in order for the Chinese to access the internet, they need a certain degree of technical savvy. They need to be able to download special software called virtual private networks to get around this censorship apparatus, which is commonly called the Great Firewall. Using this software can carry risks. It can lead to arrests, and police are increasingly enforcing these punishments against users. And I think the implications of that are pretty far-reaching. I think we are sort of increasingly living in a world where the populations of the two most powerful countries on earth are consuming wildly, vastly different media diets. It's kind of almost an international parallel to what you might see in terms of the political polarization in the United States between the left and the right, and sort of the news that they consume, and how that shapes their thinking. And so, if you were to look at international coverage of the protests in Hong Kong this past year, you would have seen something that was vastly different from how it was portrayed inside China. And as a result, I think, you would have seen a tremendous amount of nationalism inside China, people sort of really rallying around the government to condemn the protests as violent rioters. I worry a lot, actually, about the depths of this information divide. I think that, today, especially, the Chinese government has grown increasingly sophisticated at how it conducts what it calls public opinion guidance. So for every major news event, there are not only state media articles, but also a flurry of social media articles that also sort of gently nudge public opinion in a certain direction. That's now spread overseas, and as we've seen, one of the most popular social media accounts actually in the last couple of years has been this account on WeChat called College Daily for overseas Chinese students often studying in the US. This was started by a couple of college students who had interned at Western companies like Cisco and accountancy firms. But they put up a lot of content every day that toes the party line, including sort of a very, very how shall I say, very, very it basically disinformation during the height of the Hong Kong protests last year. And I think that certainly has an effect on the Chinese population, not only inside China, inside the Great Firewall, but also around the world.
So that observation triggers a couple of questions. The first is, going back to how people in China are using VPNs to see foreign information. First question is, do you think that the Chinese government took the opportunity to expel these American journalists because of concerns that their information is flowing back into China? Or do you think it was more in response to the US government's decision to severely restrict the access of Chinese so-called state media organizations like CGTN and Xinhua in the US, which I think was the sort of official explanation, but which, based on what you've just said now, you could understand why people in foreign policy might be concerned at flows of information going back into China that are perhaps representing a Communist Party point of view as opposed to what might be described as a more factual point of view.
Certainly, I think it's a tricky question to answer. I think if we were to take the broader view over a larger time period, I think in the last decade, China has increasingly used visas as a way to sort of keep foreign journalists in line, to not sort of cross red lines into areas that they don't want coverage. For example, the private sort of business and financial interests of the top leaders. We have seen a growing number, I think, according to the Foreign Correspondents Club of China, more than a dozen journalists have been expelled in something like the last 7 years, or I should say effectively expelled by the Chinese government when they let their visas expire, effectively forcing them out. So, we, of course, had one instance last year when the Chinese government expelled a Wall Street Journal reporter who was involved in a story about a relative of President Xi Jinping. Fast forward, we have, I can say that the immediate trigger of the expulsion of the dozen or so from the American newspapers stemmed from the U.S. Move to sharply limit the number of visas that Chinese state media outlets could have, from about 160 down to 100. And so certainly there's an element of the tit and tat, and it takes two to tango. Let's put it that way. And since then, in the last couple of weeks, the U.S., the Trump administration has continued to hit back with more basically quite onerous restrictions on Chinese journalists who want to seek visas. And so, I think the overall trend in China domestically has been a gradual tightening of the media. They've taken a much more assertive and sort of kind of a pugnacious attitude towards the foreign media. At the same time, I think they've encountered a counterparty in the Trump administration that seems more than willing to sort of trade blows on this issue that I think many journalists, including foreign correspondents and myself in China, would see as basically a race to the bottom, that this can't have a good outcome for anybody.
How difficult, how onerous was it to cover China pre-COVID, and how did it change? I'd be interested just sort of in your career trajectory when you first came to China, and how things have changed for journalists in that time.
Sure. I first arrived in 2014. So, I think that I, missed those golden years of the 80s, like, we were just talking to Dinda about, of sort of that, opening, that blossoming. I think that in the early 2000s, there was also a great amount of openness and blogging. Of course, in the 1990s, after Tiananmen, foreign journalists, whenever they couldn't even leave Beijing, right? So basically, you had a shadow, kind of a tail with you physically all the time. In the 2010s, when I arrived, we never had that. But I think surveillance through electronic means has been pervasive, and I think one of the big things that always kind of got to me I'm sorry, I think the light just went off here in my WeWork. Sorry, guys.
We can still see you. It's fine.
Okay. The biggest things that sort of got to me were, I think, a growing fear among the ordinary people, or a growing distrust among the ordinary people towards the foreign press. That story I told you earlier, of that response you get of, oh, you're here to smear us. Oh, the foreign press is, it's their bad, I think has grown more prevalent in the last couple of years. And, as optimistic as I am that the scholars and the sort of the intellectuals very much want to continue to engage with the outside world and the United States through intermediaries like reporters, I think they also feel a much more pressure to not really speak candidly. Often, we get tidbits here and there off the record from government advisors who might express their frustration with how things are going. But as the political climate in China, I think, becomes more tightly controlled, they're also much more cautious. And in terms of the mechanics of reporting in China, like I said, with the sort of the rise of WeChat, I hear stories of correspondents before my generation who would duck into restaurants to borrow a phone, to call their source. And there's little things that you can do sort of in the cat and mouse game that every China correspondent sort of, picks up. And today that's just so much more difficult. I've had instances where because WeChat, which is a software program that's very closely monitored, because it's so ubiquitous and you have really no other way of reaching somebody other than that software. Sometimes you might call somebody who wants to talk to you, wants to give you information, and then an hour later they get a call from the local police. And so it's always tricky.
So this explosion of journalists came basically amid this COVID crisis. And COVID, as some people in the US like to point out, originated in China. And there was a period of time when information about COVID was murky at best and suppressed clearly by the government. what has been the role of foreign journalists? What was the impact of foreign journalists in covering this particular crisis, especially at the beginning when the government was not being as forthcoming as it probably should have been with information about what was happening in Wuhan?
I think that the having an independent foreign media was tremendously important. There were in fact many citizens inside Wuhan who I've kept in touch with, and I spoke to at that time in real time, who were enormously frustrated with the coverage that they were seeing in China's official state media, which was basically interview after interview with medical workers who were talking about sort of the kind of the success that they were having in battling the outbreak, and not really, I think, offering a picture of the true scale and the enormity of the human tragedy and of this problem. That said, even if that the world media had reported that, it's not clear, as we later saw, that governments around the world would have made adequate preparations and really took that to heart. But I think that absent that reporting, maybe our understanding of those early days would have been even more limited.
It looked at the beginning in January, as a reader of China coverage, that as people in China were discovering the severity of the Wuhan crisis, that the leadership was somewhat back-footed, that it was looking vulnerable. It was looking like it had screwed up, and that people were angry both with the slowness of the response and then angry with the overwhelming force of the reaction when they finally shut everything down. Do you think it had, subsequent to that, obviously, we've seen other countries, including the United States, fumble in their own ways. And I wonder if that's been redemptive in some way for the Chinese leadership with their people, or whether COVID has actually in any way hurt the Chinese leadership standing with the people.
Yeah, my personal analysis, I've always kind of been skeptical that this would have been the Chernobyl moment that would have sort of poked holes inside the veneer of the Communist Party monolith and sort of brought everything crashing down. I think that we did see for a brief period an outpouring of rage and frustration, particularly around the death of the so-called whistleblower Dr. Li Wenliang. The night that he died, I remember staying up in a hotel in eastern China in this basically totally abandoned mega city of like 10 million people. The outpouring was of just unprecedented scale of sort of messages on social media, but of course, basically by dawn, by 6 a.m., it was completely scrubbed from the internet. You couldn't really tell that anything had happened. At the end of the day, nobody was able to go out into the streets and mobilize. And pretty soon after that, a couple of weeks after that, the Chinese government did indeed bring the domestic outbreak pretty much under control. President Xi went and visited Wuhan. And I think in the week since, the Chinese government line that we have indeed done a pretty good job at bringing this outbreak under control compared to countries in Europe, especially compared to the United States, which is by and far the biggest sort of casualty of the epidemic. I think that's resonated with the Chinese people, combined with this sort of wall-to-wall propaganda and spin about the good deeds that the government has done, combined with, oh, look at how the outside world is blaming us for their own failures. I think the siege mentality plus the genuine accomplishments of the Chinese government combined has been very effective in bringing the people to rally around the government. That said, I think we do often see cracks showing among the elite levels. We see more sort of dissent, whether it's direct or oblique, from intellectuals, from elite businessmen more than ever. And I think that, if we are to see some kind of significant political change or reform in China in the coming years, it's going to come from those voices, that the people inside the elite circles of government, inside business, inside academia, who say that enough is enough with the sort of the direction, the totalitarian direction that things are heading in.
So we've been getting some questions, and just for everybody listening, you can send questions in. There's a little button at the bottom of the screen that says Q&A, and I'll take a look at them and relay those questions. And one of the questions that's coming is from Mudit Jain, who's asking whether the Chinese people really like the Communist Party, whether they just put up with it. And maybe that's an opportunity for you to talk about one of the stories in your collection of stories that won the prize this year, which was a terrific story about how the Communist Party is clamping down on communists at Beijing University, and contained one of the all-time great quotes from somebody, a student who was, I guess, arrested. He said, "They sell fascism as socialism like a street vendor passes off dog meat as lamb," which didn't sound terribly supportive of the government. But can you talk a bit about that story, how it came about? Because it seems to go a little bit what you're talking about, how the Chinese government it's being attacked in two directions perhaps, and maybe you talk about that.
Yeah, I think I think the party, for the most part, I believe, has a great deal of support. I think that under Xi, Xi himself has I think very expertly pulled on the levers of nationalism, and sort of talked up reclaiming China's position in the world, and sort of presenting China as this global superpower that and I think that has ignited a lot of popular support around him. He's also he's a bit of a populist himself, well, actually very much so. So he talks often about poverty alleviation. When I travel around the country, from the conversations that I have, it seems that people sort of at the very bottom levels of society do buy into that. But I think, he is having to make those arguments precisely because the government has been under sort of these pressures from all sides. There is a large part of the country, I think, especially the business world, who would like to see the country liberalize more, continue with its reforms and opening up. And they are afraid that Xi is sort of pulling the country back towards this kind of Maoist direction under the complete and unyielding control of the Communist Party. And they worry about that. They would sort of want the party to take a sort of more of a back seat and kind of provide more social and political freedoms. On the other hand, the tremendous growth that we've seen in China since the Deng Xiaoping years in the early 1980s, basically neoliberal economics. And that has also frustrated many, many people who remain at the very bottom of society, who feel that this is a country that's kind of given up on some of those early values. And so, the story that I wrote was about these young Marxists. They're really sort of, dyed-in-the-wool Mao fans. And they felt like, the income inequality had grown too great in this country. It has kind of lost a lot of those sort of cultural values that it once believed in. And so they spoke up and protested and organized with workers, doing the exact same things that Mao Zedong and his comrades had done, 70 years, 80 years prior. But of course, under the sort of the totalitarian system that we're in today, any challenge from either the right or the left, and particularly the left, is viewed as a potentially destabilizing threat. And so they were snuffed out pretty quickly. But but I had actually spent several years talking to sort of people on the Chinese left. So these old soldiers inside the army who were decommissioned, these workers, these student Marxists, and I think that dissatisfaction with the government takes many forms, and so the contradictions that we see in society today, that has informed, I think, Xi's view that the party needs to just clamp down further, tighten further, and rule with an iron fist to maintain social stability. And so that's where we are.
Another question we just got is, someone has asked if you could elaborate on the footage of the extreme lockdown measures taken by local authorities, e.g. welding people into their apartment buildings or placing electronic sensors on people. How severe was that kind of clampdown in China? Was there on the food supply chain? I guess this is a question about the U.S. thoughts on the Smithfield meatpacking plants, but that's Chinese owned. But I mean, just how severe was the clampdown in China during COVID?
In places like Wuhan, it was absolutely severe, and in other cities across the country as well. I was in Hangzhou during the sort of the early days of the outbreak, and I was talking to somebody there who was he had traveled back home from outside of his province, and the neighborhood committee basically escorted him back he and his family back into his apartment, and then threw a chain around his door and then padlocked it. And so he's banging on it, and he's like, "Guys, you can't keep me in here. I mean, I'm what if there's a fire, and I can't get anybody's attention." And so I think that in many of these areas, people were deadly serious about enforcing the rules. In other areas, it kind of depends district by district. The neighborhood committees in China, often when you have these sort of mass mobilization campaigns, it's everybody's kind of winging it, to be honest. It kind of depends on how every unit, every sort of local organization interprets the rules. In Beijing, it was quite intense. I have heard of stories of friends who had come to Beijing, and they were put into hotels and given electronic key cards to their doors that could only be used once, which is a pretty clever way of, right? You can get out, but you can't, get back into your room. So yeah, I think that, it is every neighborhood across the country kind of, padlocking residents inside their homes. I don't think so, but it's pretty tough stuff.
Yeah, China, my experience with China is there's always among the bureaucracy, a certain enthusiasm for enforcement. I used to joke that China has two modes: tolerate and repress, and they basically toggle between the two.
Yeah, exactly.
Someone else has asked about to take us in a completely new direction, but an interesting one. Talking about the frictions between the U.S. and China, the current 5G competition, and the situation around Huawei. I guess the question is, what's your view on it? But let me elaborate on the question without knowing what the questioner's intention is, but ask, the technological rivalry between the U.S. and China, as well as the trade and economic rivalry, increasingly threatens to split the world into two camps, or this is a great concern. And as the U.S. cuts off China from certain technologies, it forces China to build those technologies itself, which simply, widens the gulf. Do you think that this is where things are going? Are we entering a world from the economic trade technology perspective of a U.S. bloc and a China bloc?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the direction that things are going. I think one piece of context I would add to that is that I think, ever since I arrived in China in 2014, I remember writing about China's efforts to sort of become technologically sort of independent, not dependent on U.S. technology. And so at the time, they were sort of, strongly already beginning measures to sort of push out American providers such as Cisco and Qualcomm and Microsoft through various measures to sort of develop its domestic industry, which they have every right, from a national industrial policy perspective, to do to further their own sort of national interests. But I think that this process, in many ways, this confrontation that we're seeing in many ways might be almost inevitable if you look at the trends of where things have been, the direction in which things have been unfolding in the last couple of years. Not only do I see a sort of distinct spheres in terms of technology, but I worry that, as I said earlier, information will become sort of divided into these two kind of mutually exclusive spheres. I worry that culturally there might be greater distance. There is a growing sort of suspicion of Chinese students in America, Chinese scholars and researchers. And I think that, in many cases, aside from the espionage threats, I think that there is, I worry that American society and Chinese society increasingly find it difficult to sort of have a conversation on many of these major issues of global importance. So aside from the internet, China basically had already walled itself off sort of 10 years ago. So we were already moving in that direction. Now it seems like technology, I guess finance would be a big question to see, whether China would take some steps to sort of extricate itself from the dollar system and the American banking system. And of course, the biggest question of all is geopolitics. We have in the last couple of years seen China gain a great deal of support and prestige internationally, particularly from the developing world, through its sort of lending programs, through its very assiduous diplomacy. We have also seen, I think it's fair to say, a very sharp pullback in terms of U.S. standing internationally as a leader, and also its commitments to world organizations. And so I think that is going to be such a major battleground now. Is our countries going to rally around China? Which direction is Europe going to go? Which direction is Russia going to go? The Gulf states, sort of the chessboard is kind of laid out, and it's kind of it's sort of playing out and pretty with mind-blowing speed.
So I see that trend. I also see a sort of counter trend, which is while China is able to project a sort of unified face of China to the world, China is not unified at home. China, Xi Jinping has failed pretty miserably to manage what you might call the peripheral populations, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the people of Hong Kong, and I wouldn't say Taiwan is even a peripheral population. It's a desired population. But he has these great internal frictions. And as your story on the Hui people showed, which would be interesting to talk about, the Hui are, another Islam following minority in central China. It's not a cohesive China. He has trouble holding it together. And it seems that Xi is actually having more trouble holding it together than his predecessor did. Maybe that's unfair to him, but I'd be interested to know, how does that affect his ability to govern China and to project power in the world?
I think that this is such a huge issue that I kind of have some trouble wrapping my my arms around it myself. But I think that a lot of these sort of tensions and frictions that you're seeing today are kind of a vestige, a legacy of the Qing dynasty's breadth, right? I mean, it basically stretched from the middle of modern Kyrgyzstan, down to modern day Vietnam. And it's just, it itself was a sort of a foreign kind of sort of ethnic, ruling caste. And so, today China it's so diverse, it's so large, it has so many sort of different cultural backgrounds, and is trying to keep everything together. And Xi's kind of basic MO, or his basic strategy, has been to kind of do nation building through, I think, a quite a narrow vision of ethno-nationalism, what it means to be Chinese. Much of that is kind of centered around, of course, the Han majority identity. And so, the education campaigns that he's introduced in Xinjiang, the basic concept of that is to build patriotism, is to enhance this awareness, this sense among these people who culturally and linguistically and in terms of their phenotype are very much different from Han Chinese, but he's trying to sort of inculcate forcibly the sense that they are Chinese, they're taught the same Chinese sort of children's books that Han Chinese elsewhere might be taught, and to sing the songs, to even get married wearing sort of ethnic Han costumes. And so yeah, I think that it's the authoritarian, I guess, twist on what's actually been historically a kind of a very commonly seen tactic of nation building.
One of your stories was a fascinating story from across the border in Tajikistan, I think it was.
Yeah.
And you came across a Chinese military encampment there. How did you come to that story, if you can talk about it? And what does it tell us about China's ambitions in its near abroad?
Sure. I actually, that story kind of had roots quite early. I think it was in 2016 when I started to. I was working at the Associated Press at the time. My editor, Jillian Wong, who's now at the New York Times, we wanted to start looking into the issue of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, because she had great sources through her sort of nearly 10 years working in China. And we kind of had the idea to sort of travel to Turkey and also Central Asia. And I think that, in the course of my reporting at that time, the angle actually initially that we were looking into was the phenomenon of Uyghur militants who are leaving China through Southeast Asia to go to Turkey, to then travel into Syria to join with sort of Al-Qaeda affiliated militias there. During the course of that reporting, we sort of met with a lot of these refugees, Uyghur refugees in Turkey, who told us about this massive campaign of detention and re-education and basically disappearance that was unfolding inside their homeland. And then sort of, I guess it was out of that, train of reporting that got me aware of not only what was happening in Xinjiang, but also what China was doing to sort of counter this threat of potential Uyghur extremism, whether it was Chinese military activity in Syria or this very concrete example that I was able to eventually prove in Tajikistan. And so So what we basically found was that there is a what I basically found was that there is a chain. A source had told me that they had seen Chinese soldiers in this very, very remote town in the Pamir Mountains of Tajikistan, near the highest point in the former Soviet Union. And so I thought I would go check it out. And what I had found was indeed there was a Chinese military base there. And later, according to satellite imagery, we discovered that there was actually more than one. And so on, I think, one of my last days that I was there, just kind of poking around, I ran into one of these guys who had come into town. I had already talked to some of the locals who said, yeah, for the last couple of years, there's been these Chinese guys. They're nice. They come into town. They buy water and potato chips and sort of, they'll speak a couple words of Russian, but kind of leave us alone and then disappear. We have no idea what they're doing. And so I thought, okay, all right, maybe I could run into one of these guys. And on my last day in this town, I was just kind of walking around, going to buy some water myself, and boom, I run into one of these guys and sort of, chat him up, and he says, oh, he basically told me, what I wanted to know. So it was a bit of, it was a stroke of luck, but also I think, it was rooted in reporting that had gone back several years. So I'm happy that, something like that was able to come to fruition.
Yeah, very revealing. Two last questions from me. First is, when did you decide you wanted to write about China?
This opportunity came up. I was working at Reuters, in 2014 when this opportunity came up. I actually didn't expect to go to China at the time. But, I speak Chinese. I have the language advantage. I'm familiar with the culture. And so I think that, when the opportunity came up, I seized it. I think it's, it's so central and more central every day to global events.
Do you think you'll be allowed to work as a journalist in China again?
I hope so. I sincerely hope so, and I think I will. When I left, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said, you don't blame us, blame it on the United States. We had to kick you out. It's not personal, but we had to kick you out because they, because they kicked out our state media reporters. Do I believe that 100%? Not 100%, but I suppose. Should I take their word for it? That there might be a day when I'll be allowed to go back and report. Sure, I'll hold on to that thought.
Well, we'll be hoping that you can. I think what this conversation underscores is the tremendous value that a strong, intelligent, capable journalist working for an American news organization can bring to the world through their work in China. And I think it's been a great loss to those of us who value good information to see that people like you are not able to work in China, but I remain hopeful as you do that you'll be back in and that the other journalists will be back in someday. And I hope that our two governments can find their way to increasing the number of people doing journalism in each country and widening the understanding. But I'd like to thank you very much for your time, and congratulations again, Gerry. I'd like to thank the audience for joining this conversation this morning. Please watch asiasociety.org for coming events. They're doing other events like this. Never been an easier time to participate in events. You don't have to leave your house or put on change out of your pajamas. And it's a great opportunity to really widen your horizons and hear fascinating and important conversations like the one we had today with Gerry. So thank you, Gerry. Congratulations again. Thanks to all of our participants, to Dinda, to Tom, to the Asia Society for organizing this.
Thanks so much, Marcus.
Thank you.